I'll stay gold. You'll stay gold. I'll stay gold. You'll stay gold. Welcome back to the show, Metalheads and Metal Butts. It's me, Emma, the heavy metal lawyer. Tomorrow, September 25th, Metal in Beer Fest will be kicking off in Philadelphia with three headliners playing their classic albums Pig Destroyer, Napalm Death, and Converge. I've already done tier list on Pig Destroyer and Napalm Death. So now it is time for Converge. And then, hey, maybe I'll keep doing these on metal bands with big discographies. What would you want to hear next? A Carcass tier list for the death metal or grind fans? Or maybe you've heard enough about grindcore bands and want me to cover the discographies of thrash metal bands like Destruction, or black metal upstarts like Panopticon, or sludge metal abominations like Melvins. I love to cover any of those bands and many, many more others, so just leave a comment or DM me if you have an idea. Oh, Converge! The importance of Converge to metalheads of my generation cannot be understated, especially the album that they will be performing at Metal and Beer Fest, Jane Doe, which is made all the more interesting by the fact that their status as metal is contentious. While certainly not the arbitrator of what is or is not metal, this tension is certainly highlighted by famed Internet Metal Archive Encyclopedia Metallum not having an entry for Converge. Though, oddly enough, they do have an entry for Jacob Bannon, where he is listed as the vocalist for Converge, which is listed as a metalcore band. So, not exactly sure how they square that circle. But this is definitely an issue I'll be talking about in this video because prior to their album Axe to Fall, Converge was more often than not referred to as a hardcore band, albeit on the most extreme side of hardcore. Is hardcore a type of metal? I have always thought that it is now, for all intents and purposes, due to the blurring of crossover between genres, particularly the beatdown hardcore sound that is so popular today with bands like Code Orange and Knocked Loose. Even with the original hardcore brands, Black Flag pretty quickly went into sludge metal territory once Henry Rollins became the singer and Greg Ginn started smoking more weed. Not to mention all the crossover acts like Suicidal Tendencies, Gangrene, and Circle Jerks. But without further ado, let's jump into this. First up is Halo in a Haystack, the debut album of the band, which the band holds in such high regard that they've never reprinted it. That was sarcasm, if it wasn't clear. To be fair, the band has put out all the tracks except Exhale on compilation, so maybe it is just Exhale they don't like. Converge came out of the famous, or perhaps I should say infamous, Boston hardcore scene where the bands range from straight edge metalheads like straight edge meatheads like SSD Control to hedonistic meatheads like Gangrene. But if you know anything about me, I actually love that caveman ass type hardcore, and I especially love SSD Control. Boiling Point is definitely one of the greatest hardcore songs of all time. Anyways, Converge from the beginning was a bit different in their approach and influences. While Boston has always been dominated by beatdown hardcore and its predecessors with simple, addictively catchy breakdowns to go crazy to in the pit, Converge is very intellectual and highly technical with unusual song structures, insanely difficult riffs courtesy of legendary guitarist Kurt Ballow, and that approach, sometimes referred to as mathcore, was really given life by Converge, who preceded other godfathers of the genre like Botch and the Dillinger Escape Plan. But Converge was able to make it in Boston and in the 90s East Coast scene in general, which featured bands like Earth Crisis, Cro-Mags, and Slapshot, because they were heavy as fuck and their shows went hard as fuck. Their adoption of sounds and styles from early emo and screamo music got a pass from the same people who would tell you they hate that kind of music just because Converge did it in such a heavy way. That being said, for Halo, Jacob's vocals on this album suck, which is hard to hear from one of the greatest extreme music vocalists of all time, but it is what it is. So with that in mind, Halo in a Haystack goes on C tier for me. Next up is Petitioning the Empty Sky in 1996. I got into Converge around 2008, and like most bands that I get into, the second album I checked out was the band's first album, which I incorrectly thought was Petitioning the Empty Sky due to the fact that Halo in a Haystack has never been re-released. And it's probably good that I did go to that rather than Halo in a Haystack, because a C-tier album probably would have turned me off from exploring the whole discography. But this album blew my fucking mind. And of course, that mindfuckery began immediately with the screeching, urgent first riff in the opening track, The Saddest Day, followed shortly by Jacob jumping on the track with his raspy, howling screams. That was cool enough to begin with, but I quickly realized another reason this wasn't like any of the 80s hardcore I had been listening to throughout high school. The song wasn't over after 2.5 minutes. In fact, the song is 7 minutes long, a feat still rarely seen in hardcore till this day. With experimental riffs and an epic length, you could be forgiven for assuming that the song wouldn't go as hard as the most heavy hardcore bands of that time. But you'd be wrong, because at the 2-minute mark, the song breaks into one of the greatest and most infectiously simple hardcore breakdowns of all time, followed by a Slayer-esque guitar solo. The album does get criticized for being top-heavy, which is true to a certain extent, and we'll see that this is something of a persistent problem for Converge. And part of the reason was that the album is a quasi-compilation album with different segments having been recorded and released at different times, though ultimately it was put out as a full length. But I think this criticism gets blown out of proportion, especially because those listeners who endure a couple of filler tracks are rewarded at the end with the track Color Me Blood Red, my second favorite track of the album. And this is also when you first start to see vocalist Jacob's equally impressive talent as an artist, with the cover art for the album, which he collaborated with another notable musician / visual artist, Aaron Turner of Isis and Old Man Gloom. This one goes on A tier for me. Next up is When Forever Comes Crashing, which also features artwork from Aaron Turner in the remaster of the album, and is most notable for having more guest vocalists than a gospel album, most notably Ben Cummings of Bane and Jay Randall of Agoraphobic Nosebleed. The album is more frantic than Petitioning, presaging what was to come with the band's next full-length album. While there are tracks on this album I like, particularly Love as Arson, overall the band seems to sacrifice that great epic sound of Petitioning to be more frantic, and with this album, it doesn't quite pay off. So this one goes on B tier for me. But now is the moment all of y'all have been waiting for. Jane Doe. This was the album that had Converge explode in popularity, including going beyond the hardcore scene and into the metal scene. In particular, the album scored the #1 position in that year's issue of Terrorizer magazine's Best Metal Albums of the Year. It can also be considered the last album of early Converge, with guitarist Aaron Dalbeck leaving after the album to focus on his band Bane, and the lineup of the band being the same ever since. That lineup had two crucial additions for Jane Doe, which were Nate Newton and Ben Collar. While Jacob and Kurt get a lot of the spotlight, and for good reason, the difference in quality between Petitioning and other early Converge and Jane Doe is due to these two additions, namely Nate's contributions to songwriting and Ben pushing the band to use more interesting rhythms and sound structures. Those more interesting rhythms and song structures are the immediate hook of Jane Doe with the opener Concubine. The playing is frantic like what you heard on Forever, but now the frantic is focused and structured. Other highlights of the album are Homewrecker, Phoenix in Flight, and Phoenix in Flames, and of course the title track, Jane Doe. Unlike prior albums, Jacob's vocals hit the mark consistently through the album, making this the first album where his talent is really on full display. And of course, the album artwork, designed by Bannon himself, has become the iconic symbol of the band more than any other image. Kurt Ballow's talents on this album also come through in the production and recording quality of the album. While Ballow founded his studio, God City Studio, in 1998, he has himself said that working on Jane Doe with Matthew Ellard, an insanely prolific and talented producer, was how he cut his teeth. One thing I do want to touch on is how the album title, the artwork, the song titles, and lyrics do make me somewhat uncomfortable to this day. It is a bit weird to use a dead woman with no name as your band mascot, and while the band got a lot of praise for the poetic lyrics on the album, it can be hard to appreciate that poetic value when it is things like, quote, "You were most beautiful as the damage and the trauma," that's from the song Fault and Fracture, or, quote, "I'll take my love to the grave," that's from the song The Broken Vow, or, quote, "You'll find me as the time bomb," that's from the song Thaw. Don't get me wrong here, I have no problems with songs about bad breakups and the ugly side of love and bitter feelings and so on. It's just the implicit and sometimes explicit threats of violence that make me uncomfortable. That being said, the band should definitely get props for making this album have a cohesive theme, and the lyrics from each song reverberate with each other. And so yeah, I gotta put this one on S tier, even if this album makes me never want to be in a room alone with Jacob Bannon. I mean, if that was a disqualifier, I probably wouldn't be able to listen to Pig Destroyer at all. After Jane Doe came in 2004, You Fail Me. This album has the track In Her Blood, which makes my complaints about Jane Doe seem meek in comparison. This track definitely crosses the line for me of rolling my eyes so hard at it that I can barely pay attention to the music. Just violent male temper tantrum. Not a good look, not artistic or poetic. I mean, he literally calls a woman a whore, and the song is just stupid. The album does have some tracks I like, particularly the 1-2 punch of Heartless and You Fail Me, as well as the track which became one of my favorite music videos of all time, Eagles Become Vultures. The album hits a lot harder when introspective, rather than when it is just raging in crude ways. It is definitely a favorite album of the band. They even put out a remastered version of it somewhat recently because they like the songs but were not happy about the quality in the original release. It really is an album of ups and downs for me. The ups very high and downs some of the worst songs in Converge's discography. So this one goes on B tier for me. Now we come to the first Converge album that I ever listened to, No Heroes. While this isn't going to be the highest ranked album on my tier list, it is my personal favorite to listen to just for the nostalgia value. This was the album where I learned to respect extreme metal, which frankly I had not for most of high school, focusing mostly on 80s hardcore, new wave of British heavy metal, and so on. I remember buying this at For Your Entertainment at the Patrick Henry Mall in Newport News, Virginia. I also bought Stag by Melvins that same day, so it was quite the formative trip to the mall for me. I put it on driving home, and I was just floored from the very beginning. It was so heavy, but also so interesting in terms of songwriting and technical ability. It was in many ways the perfect introduction for me to Converge, a baptism of fire, because this is probably Converge's hardest hitting album. You don't really get a breather until Grim Heart Black Rose, which is not so much of a breather given that it is about as relaxing as a panic attack, even if it has less screaming and less all-out barrage of sound than the previous tracks. Unfortunately, the next three tracks, Orphaned, Lone Wolves, and Verses, fail to restart the energy on the album. This album, as good as it is, definitely fits into the category of Converge's top-heavy albums. I used to give it a break, telling myself that no band was capable of keeping up that energy and power for a whole album. But then I listened to Jane Doe and realized they actually could do that. One other qualm I have with this album, I think it should have ended with the track Trophy Scars. Holy shit, I love this song so much. I used to drive way over the speed limit, sorry mom, windows down, blaring this and screaming along so loud that I'd lose my voice. I'm not even against the tracks that follow it, Bare My Teeth and To the Lions. They're both good songs, but Trophy Scars could have ended the album in a fucking perfect climax. Maybe a reordered New Heroes, cutting a couple of tracks would be S tier, but I'll have to put it on A tier. Sorry, baby, the structure of albums is just too important. But boy, oh boy, did Converge show that it could avoid being both top-heavy and poorly structured, or, not perfectly structured, with the next album, Axe to Fall, the best Converge album of all time, in my opinion, and one of the best albums of all time, period. Definitely in my top 5, along with Aretha Franklin, Marvin Gaye, The Clash, and Nux Vomica. It's a weird top 5, I know. I would think the band was just showing off, particularly with the guitar in Dark Horse, Effigy, and Deadbeat. The shredding on these songs really shows the band fully embracing metalcore as a genre, though some tracks like Axe to Fall calm any worries that Converge is leaving hardcore behind. The lyrics on the album are creative and compelling, from infectiously simple shots of dread, like waiting for the axe to fall, off of Axe to Fall, to the politically thoughtful rage, like, quote, your karma has been racking debts, left your throne in foreclosed homes, claimed that crown of decay, built castle walls with blood and bone to shield your soul from wither and decay. But the rage wasn't just for the shitty people responsible for the foreclosure crisis that was on the forefront of every American's mind in 2009. It was also for the inability of the victims to do anything about it. Like in the song Effigy, with the lyrics, quote, distorted hearts worship God's currency. That is so worthless to me. The poor eat the poor just like we've done before. Cursed by the burden youth brings. I can't tell you how cathartic it was as a young socialist surrounded by Obama loyalists pretending like everything was going to be all right to sing along to those lyrics. And let's talk about Cruel Bloom. Folks, can we talk about Cruel Bloom? Tom Waits ass metal right here in that song Cruel Bloom. Holy fucking fuckery. If you don't know what I'm talking about, turn off this video, go listen to Axe to Fall, and you should listen to the whole album because the effect of Cruel Bloom is best felt by listening to everything leading up to it. If you're anything like me, you'll get to this song and be like, what the fuck am I listening to? Did I get switched to another album? But trust me, it is fantastic. It is the epitome of how bold and interesting Converge could be and how they could shape metal as a genre itself. And yeah, obviously, S tier. S tier. Axe to Fall set the expectations very high for Converge beyond what had already been set by Jane Doe, which again was considered Album of the Year in 2001 by a lot of people. By touring with bands like Mastodon, they were able to reach audiences far, far beyond their usual listeners. And of course, this was the new golden era for Relapse Records. So while Converge stuck to Epitaph Records themselves, they were smart enough to tour with the hipster metal bands and ride that wave. The band put out some singles in the interim, like On My Shield in 2010, to stave off fans' appetites for a new album, which wouldn't come until 2012. On My Shield is, in my opinion, one of the worst songs Converge has ever put out. It is boring and corny, and that being the first new Converge following Axe to Fall made me scared for what the next album would entail. Finally, in 2012, Converge put out All We Love We Leave Behind. This album is essentially a continuation of the same sound and style they employed in Axe to Fall. Very metalcore without completely abandoning hardcore. You can just listen to the tracks Tender Abuse or Sparrow's Fall, and lots of mathy riffs. But as I said in my Napalm Death tier list video, I'm pretty hard on bands that repeat themselves, even when what is being repeated is pretty good. And that's how I feel about All We Love. With expectations set high, the album only does two things. The songs either practically repeat Axe to Fall, or they are abominations like On My Shield, and to a lesser extent, the highly overrated title track, All We Love We Leave Behind. I mean, seriously, how much different is that opening riff from Dark Horse? It sounds almost exactly the same. It definitely feels like a resting on their laurels type album, which was very disappointing when it took 3 years for the album to come out. And I'm not judging the band too harshly for that, given the amount of touring they did for Axe to Fall and the fact that Ballo was by this time producing 10 million albums per year. For this video, I decided to give the album a fresh chance, removed from my disappointment following Axe to Fall, but age has not been kind to this album and has only made it more clear to me how redundant it is in the discography, so I'm actually going to put this one on C tier. Not below Halo in a Haystack, though. The vocals on that album are just woof. And now we are at the end, and just like with my Pig Destroyer and Napalm Death tier list, I'm happy to say that I can end on a positive note for Converge. In 2017, Converge put out the album The Dusk in Us. The album scared me at first because a single tier sounded like All We Love We Leave Behind, which sounds like Dark Horse at first, and I was like, oh no, here we go again. But about a minute into that song, it changes to this dirge-like, slower and mournful part, which after 30 seconds dissipates away to let you get one breath in before some of the best riffs the band has ever done come roaring in. The epic hardcore song style of this track isn't like the prior two albums, despite the similar opening. Rather, it harkens back to No Heroes or even Petitioning the Empty Sky. But that's just the appetizer. The real standout track for this album, for me, is Under Duress. Probably in my top 5 Converge songs of all time, this song is just a menacing hardcore feat of strength, patiently pounding listeners into dust. I was very happy with this album, and if I recall correctly, it was my favorite metal album that year, or maybe in my top 5, I don't quite recall. That being said, I again tried to give it a fresh look like the other albums, and I'll admit I may have overrated it slightly in 2017 because of relief that it wasn't just another resting on their laurels album. The band's creative new takes, mostly hybrids of their new sounds and old sounds, are amazing, as mentioned, with the two prior tracks and also the final track on the album, Reptilian, a foreboding look on the world that felt very, very appropriate in 2017, but also avoided the corny fuck Trump tropes that were circulating around hardcore and metal bands at that time. But overall, these stellar moments are offset by the rest of the album, ranging from good but not great songs to mediocre songs. Nothing as bad as On Your Shield or whatever the fuck that song's called, but, less than great. Particularly the section of the album from Wildlife to Cannibals is something I've skipped pretty much since my first listen through to the album, and skipping 5 tracks is a bit hard to overlook. That being said, where the band nails it on this album, they make some of their best music ever. So overall, I'd give this one an A tier. And I hope we can hear some of these sounds and styles more fully fleshed out consistently in their next album. Please, guys, give us one more album, please. Well, that's it. Again, please let me know what tier list you'd like me to do next. And please subscribe on YouTube and on Instagram so you don't miss my videos on the sound and history of music's most wretched genre.